Hi everyone, so my name is Vicky and today I'll be talking a little bit about the motion. This house would allow victims to have a say in the punishments meted out to bullies. So we'll just be covering some of the general approaches you should take in this debate regardless what side you're on. So first, in terms of definitions, both sides should try to explore the impacts and different prescribed solutions to different kinds of bullying and different levels of severity. So of course, not every instance of bullying will necessarily have the same kind of punishment or same severity of punishment. There are levels to this, and that's something you need to explain quite clearly regardless what side of the motion you're on. Secondly, in terms of what assumptions you should make about the motion, it's probably fair to assume we're talking about the middle school to the high school level, and the government side will likely have to talk about what is the typical investigation process, how would their model be tweaked such that victims can be heard. And of course, some additional considerations. Try to take note that your judges will be watching out for who is the best able to logically and comprehensively analyze the different stakeholders in the debate. So whether it's the victims, the bullies, the school administrations, the parents that are involved, you want to, as much as possible, explain and kind of dig deep into what the motivations and interests of all of these parties are. Now that lets me move on now to aim and objectives. So the goal for either side of the house should be to resolve any instances of bullying and of course prevent further instances. But secondly, on the more principled level, you want to come to a justified punishment for the perpetrators of bullying. You want to make sure it's not too much or too little, and whether if you're on Gov, you have to explain why the model will still allow for a justified outcome and it will match the severity of the bullying. And on opposition as well, you have to explain why perhaps just the school deciding on its own would be sufficient to come to a justified punishment. So now let's explain the general cases for each side. So for the proposition side, you will probably have to set up the debate by first telling us what letting victims have a say would necessarily look like, how much influence would they have over the process, are there some mitigating factors? Secondly, you would have to kind of discuss what the process of the investigation would look like. And it's important to make the disclaimer that this model won't replace a thorough investigation. And of course, lastly, you need to explain what are the various forms of punishment for bullies to begin with. So this can range from detention to suspension to perhaps even expulsion. So these are things that you need to kind of lay out for the debate. Now, proposition arguments, there are probably three main arguments you can discuss. The first is formalizing the process of investigating bullying. This process allows us to have a very clear protocol rather than the alternative, which is that a lot of students tend to confide in individual teachers and perhaps their concerns might not be elevated properly. The second argument is how it establishes trust with the student body and helps acknowledge the victim's feelings. And this is important because we want victims to feel that they are supported, especially if they've been through a very difficult time already. And thirdly, for the proposition side, you want to talk about how it incentivizes victims to work together with authorities because they know they will be listened to. We don't want victims to feel that they must take matters into their own hands. And that often happens when they feel that they have no other choice or that nobody else is listening to their concerns. So it's very important that we give them this avenue that is formalized and that follows due process so that they're willing to cooperate with school authorities. Now, the opposition case can center, or the opposition policy rather, can center around three main ideas. The first is that a thorough investigation should be sufficient. So opposition has to explain why it's enough already that we have the school making these kinds of investigations and looking into the case of bullying. So perhaps you can tell me why it would be very thorough. It would look at potential witnesses. It would look at gathering testimonials from people involved, making sure that you're corroborating evidence with other pieces of evidence, so on and so forth. So you need to explain why it's sufficient enough by itself and why there's that incentive. Secondly, for the opposition policy setup, you need to explain why bias could come into play, especially if victims are allowed to say, because their emotional state can impact their decision making. So of course that is a valid emotional response to what they've gone through. But in terms of due process, you need to explain why school administrations shouldn't really allow this to have significant sway over the punishment, because again, they will still be conducting their own investigation and will find out the severity of these things anyway, even without direct influence from the victim. So that's something that you have to discuss as well. And lastly, of course, in the policy setup for opposition, you have to explain why this might lead to unjust outcomes or even excessive punishment. as opposition, you want to say that the goal of punishment shouldn't merely be punitive, but it should also be rehabilitative, especially since we're talking about minors. So we want to allow bullies the opportunity to change and reform as individuals. We don't just want them to, be expelled or be suspended suddenly without additional measures to make sure these are actually productive forms of punishment that help them become better people. Now, for the opposition arguments, there are three general arguments you can run. The first is that the model that government proposes would hurt the ability of schools to conduct investigations without bias and interference. So, of course, if there are victims who are involved and have active say throughout the investigation, throughout the decision-making on the punishment, this is something schools will have to navigate throughout the entire process. And it does draw attention away from all of these other things they need to be focusing on so they come to a good outcome and a good decision. Now, the second general argument you can run is how realistically victims have the incentive to pick harsher punishments. So you have to prove that this is the case, because this really is the pivotal harm of the opposition side. Again, you can say that it is a valid emotional response, but in terms of whether it actually will help bullies reform and prevent future instances of bullying, it's probably not very helpful if we automatically default to the most extreme forms of punishment, which somebody who has been bullied is likely to want after the kinds of suffering they've been put through. And the last possible argument I think you can bring up, again, of course, this is not exhaustive, but this is generally what would be good to run. You can discuss how the model may erode trust among students and administrators. So, of course, cases of bullying are also not always black and white. There are some instances where perhaps it is both parties aggravating one another, and it is not just a one-sided bullying, but it might be made out to seem like bullying, in which case, the moment that someone is identified as the victim of the case, this might make the administration or school authorities automatically side with them and might make it very hard for the other party to have their side heard as well. So we want to avoid potential bias on the side of the authorities as well. And with that, just a quick summary to wrap it all up. This outcome of the debate will depend on who's able to best characterize and uphold the interests of the victim. So, of course, each team has their own mechanism by which to do that, but as long as you are as comprehensive as you can be and as clear as you can be, ideally you should be able to win the debate. And that's it for this motion. Thank you.